So let's go on to the matter of the Gospels. And when it comes to Jesus of Nazareth, can we really even trust anything that's described about him in the Gospels? Is this the result of legend making? Or is there a kernel, or perhaps even larger than a kernel, is there a complete history that is contained within these texts? Well, in 1926, skeptical Bible scholar Rudolf Bultmann wrote the following statement, quote, "I do indeed think that we can now know almost nothing about the life and personality of Jesus. I do indeed think that we can now know almost nothing about the life and personality of Jesus." Now, Rudolf Bultmann, you have to understand, was a biblical scholar of the highest order, just widely regarded. He was very, very famous for his controversial approach of, quote, demythologizing, if I could use a $10 word, demythologizing the gospel texts. Throughout his life, he continued to make one perplexing claim after another, attempting to show that the Gospels were merely, quote, legendary, and were therefore not really worthy of any serious consideration. Well, more recently, Peter Jennings, before his death, directed a prime-time documentary containing roughly the same view. In his rather scintillating special, Searching for Jesus, Jennings portrayed Christ in a very poor light. We had suspected that reliable sources would be hard to come by, and sometimes they were, Jennings noted. And he then went on to paint a picture of Jesus wholly incompatible with any known Christian view today. And so therefore the person of Jesus is now held in infamy. There are as many different pictures of him as there are people who paint them. At the time of this talk, there are no less than, listen, 260 articles and books written by scholars about Jesus. Many of these have been influenced by the writings of Bultmann, who taught that non-romanticized historical accounts about Christ simply do not exist. And so therefore, as recent as 1971, Leander Keck of Yale University held that the search for the real Jesus is just a, quote, dead end street. And so then, who was Jesus of Nazareth? I mean, who was he really? Was he just some kind of a cynic philosopher? Was he a sort of Jewish sage? With such a proliferation of differing opinions, many have concluded that the question really has no answer. Popular culture has therefore despaired of the project, consigning the search for the historical Jesus to perpetual uncertainty. Whatever the actual Jesus may have looked like, he could certainly bear no resemblance to the biblical icon of today. The question here then for us tonight is, are these ideas truly justifiable? Is it right for us to really think that we can know nothing about Jesus for certain? Well, though the fundamentalist Christian would certainly beg to disagree, in the eyes of most people today, and you'll find this to be true, Jesus is an enigma. Some time ago, I was actually encountering this problem personally. I was struck up a conversation with an elderly couple in a coffee shop. And I had only momentarily begun to refer to the New Testament when suddenly the elderly gentleman broke in by declaring, "What about the other Gospels?" Perhaps you've heard this objection yourself. Well, it was obvious that the man had been influenced by certain late-breaking discoveries. He had, for example, heard about the so-called Gospel of Judas. Now, the document had turned up lately in Cairo, Egypt, after being sold twice and then stolen once. According to Irish journalist Andrew Cockburn, the text had practically, quote, vanished into the netherworld of antiquities traders. And then upon its unlikely public debut, skeptic scholar Marvin Mayer told National Geographic that this new rogue gospel was written at a time when Christianity, listen, was, quote, trying to find its style. You see, this is kind of what we're running into today. But did the Judas gospel preserve an early authentic tradition? Well, the evidence seemed to defy the very possibility. For example, one scholar who worked closely on the project commented, "We all feel comfortable putting this copy in the 4th century." Now, such a late date, frankly, places the only surviving copy of Judas far too removed from the events of the crucifixion to have actually been written by the man himself. Let's just be honest. Moreover, the earliest mention of any kind of document written by Judas Iscariot only occurs 150 years after the death of Jesus Christ. And so for this reason, I urged the elderly gentleman to rethink his views. I attempted to turn his attention back to the genuine record of Scripture. You see, because when most historians today face the task of reconstructing history, they will normally rely heavily upon early eyewitness accounts. Well, in the case of the life of Jesus, hands down, these would be the biblical Gospels, commonly known to us today as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And of their historical trustworthiness, moderate scholar R.T. France wrote, quote, "We have good reason to treat the Gospels seriously as a source for the life of Jesus." Unfortunately, this point today is normally lost to skeptic people. And the man who stood before me was certainly no exception. For how, many have wondered, could the Gospels be, after all, a source of reliable, historical reminiscence about the person of Jesus? I mean, wasn't the early church supposed to be responsible for kind of fiddling with the facts? As late German theologian Albert Schweitzer once thought, quote, "The early church abolished the real Jesus to remain consistent in its own views." But here's the real thorny issue. Do these kinds of fantastic indictments truly fit the picture? I mean, could the notion that Jesus was just a Jewish cynic actually replace his biblical identity in today's world? Well, even skeptical scholars, and this is a bit of good news, even skeptical scholars are apprehensive on this point. For many have wondered how a social liberal Jesus could wind up crucified to begin with. The idea is clearly a far-fetched theory, and many skeptics doubt that it could be true. Returning to Leander Keck, himself an avowed skeptic, quote, "The idea that this Jewish cynic and his dozen hippies with his demeanor and aphorisms was a serious threat to society sounds more like the conceit of alienated academics than sound historical judgment." I mean, frankly, I couldn't have stated it better than that. That's just brilliantly worded. And so for this reason, many skeptics today are beginning to reassess the Gospels. Have you noticed? A new level of interest is beginning to arise in them in our time. And the results of the study have caused many skeptics to conclude that we can now know as much about Jesus as about any person in ancient history. Now, I would say that such a radical shift really shows us that there's a change, there's a sea change in the Guild of Scholarship compared to Rudolf Bultmann's earlier statement, quote, "We can know nothing about the person of Jesus." I tell you something, in today's world, the four Gospels, that they could somehow be thought of as an aid in recovering the real picture of Jesus, this is an idea that is beginning to catch amongst the broader Guild of Scholars today. Maybe you can remember some of the films that have recently come out. Son of God, the Bible miniseries, even the film that was put out that was based on Thomas's infancy gospel, The Young Messiah. Notice that this is beginning to reach a fever pitch in our time. On my son's first birthday party, I left to get a few last-minute errands that I needed for our party, and I noticed that there was a copy of Newsweek that was entirely dedicated to the person of Jesus. All based on theories. Who was Jesus of Nazareth? And so therefore, I began to make plain to the man that I was speaking with my confidence on this point. I spoke to him of the importance I place personally in minding the biblical text daily. For the idea that the Gospels could be the result of later legendary fiction now stands within academia as an utterly failed hypothesis. The gap of time between the life of Jesus and the authoring of the Gospels is actually a very narrow span of time. It's a very, very vanishingly small amount of time that we see. And so therefore, for this reason, legend could not have reconstrued the true Jesus and left us with a false impression of him today. However, in urging the man to see this, I could see that he was really uncomfortable. Both he and the woman sitting next to him had clearly crossed the line. You see, they had given heed to the liberal media rants that have come out in our time, which have radically undercut confidence in the Bible today. But you know, in reality, such claims really cannot bear the light of day. Under careful scrutiny, they quickly crumble and fall to pieces. And now they only serve as signposts to show that it is actually impossible for the Gospels to be the result of later legendary fiction. Please note the usage of the term impossible. Let me qualify this. It's important to note a critical distinction of what we're talking about here, namely the difference between the rise of legends and the obliteration of history. We're going to have to make a distinction here tonight between the rise of legends on the one hand and the obliteration of history on the other. You see, because no Christian scholar today seriously attempts to make the claim that legends cannot arise about a person within his or her own lifetime or within his or her own generation. I mean, Elvis is in the building, anybody, right? I mean, we all know that that's not true. Indeed, such things do occur often. They are, in fact, very, very commonplace. As popular children's book author Stephen Kellogg has noted, quote, "The legends that grew around Johnny Appleseed began during his lifetime." So we know legends grow up within the lifetime of the person for whom they are attributed. But that's not what Christian scholarship is claiming. Christian scholarship is not claiming necessarily that that is impossible, that legends about Jesus couldn't have grown up within his own lifetime about him that were false. Of course that's possible because it happens today. The point, however, is that such legends do not actually succeed in replacing the true history of those persons. Understand it this way. The stories about John Chapman, for whom the legends about Johnny Appleseed are attributed, those legends about Johnny Appleseed do not confuse historians today as to the actual history of the man, John Chapman. Everybody can see the difference. Why? Because the people that were living in the generations that saw those legends arise were there to also see and behold the life of John Chapman. And so what current scholarship has uncovered is a simple precept that I think goes back probably to A.N. Sherwin White, that you need at least 2 generations to pass before a legend can actually eclipse genuine history. Does that make sense at all? Through the writings of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, White showed that these 2 generations are needed, and he actually set up a critical test case to actually make his point. And today his work demonstrates the absurdity of the notion, really, I think, that the idea that myth or legend could somehow obscure Jesus of Nazareth. And so therefore, reaching for my Bible, I brought my argument to its conclusion. I opened to the last page of my Bible and I just set it right down there in his lap in the coffee shop. I said to him, "Would you please mind starting to read from this part of the text? Just read it out loud if you could." Well, the man kind of looked at me glibly with this sort of deadpan expression on his face. He looked at the woman, he looked back at me. He looked down at the Bible, he put on his glasses, and he began to just clear his voice and start to read. He read these words, "I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to him the plagues that are described in this book. And if anyone takes away from them, God will take away his share of the tree of life and the holy city, which are described in this book." Well, after reading that statement out loud, he looked up at me, and the color had just completely drained from his face. I mean, it was clear that this statement had shaken. I don't know what it is about when a skeptic, for the very first time, reads the words of the Bible out loud using their own voice, somehow the text just pierces their hearts in a way that it didn't before. I don't know what that is. Something about faith coming by hearing, I think. Hearing the word of God. And so therefore, seeing that the penny had dropped, I therefore properly brought my discussion to its conclusion. I said, "You see, given what you have just read out loud here this afternoon, do you think that it really would be wise for you to give any thought to those quote-unquote other gospels you mentioned a moment ago?" Well, the expression on his face clearly told me the answer to my question. And so therefore, in closing then on this particular issue, no one can deny that the Jesus of history actually behaved as he did. And the power of this simple point really cannot be overstated. In fact, even radical, skeptical Bible scholar, old Rudolf Bultmann, whom we noted at the beginning of this talk, actually admitted that the things which were described in the Gospels actually count as genuine history. Listen to this. He wrote, most of the miracle stories contained in the Gospels are legendary or at least dressed up with legends. But there can be no doubt that Jesus did such things, which were, in his and his contemporaries' understanding, miracles. That is, deeds which were the result of supernatural, divine causality. Listen to this. Doubtless he healed the sick and cast out demons. Now, when I read this statement in the context of the Leadership Institute where I lecture, this gal just shot up her hand. She said, wait a second. Hold on. That was the same guy, the guy who you said it's all just bunk, it's all coloration, it's just they're kind of, exaggerating and embellishing the stories. That same guy wrote that statement. I just kind of said, well, here's what you need to understand. When a person like this is speaking out of their own philosophical proclivities, the things that they're going to say about Jesus, they're just going to say, well, as to the existence of God, who knows? And Jesus of Nazareth, probably not who the church said he was. But you see, as a historian and as a scholar, he has to admit that based upon the canons of historical inquiry, that these texts really do stand as historical. And so therefore, I think that the point is the best illustration that you could offer. If the most radical skeptical scholar of the 20th century failed to debunk the biblical case for the historical Jesus, on what phony grounds is culture in our time trying to do the very same thing? Perhaps I think it should be time for us to begin in our own conversations with outsiders to begin to say, have you ever thought about just examining the text? Just forget about the idea if it's a divinely inspired text. Just look at it as it actually undeniably is. It's a book of stories, this remarkable story that comes down to us out of the first century, showing this remarkable person, Jesus of Nazareth. Why don't you just look at this from that perspective? Don't begin with this as a divinely inspired text. Instead, just simply ask the question, if this is history, then what does this portrait of Jesus tell me about him? And who was he? Who was he really? And as you begin to talk with your own friends and skeptics, be bold about using the text of the New Testament to do this. Because I tell you, the reversal that's taken place in our time has absolutely changed a generation of critical scholars.